Hi, everyone. We see that many of you have joined. We are just going to give one more moment for everyone who is still signing in, and then we will go ahead and kick off the event. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sarah. Just wanted to do a mic check.
Star, I hear you fine.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's event. We continue to be so excited by the number of participants who are interested in joining us for these events and to continue to push the industry forward through COVID and through social distancing. As you can see, we have a packed agenda today. We are going to start off with a few words from our Starburst co-founder, Van Espabodi, who will introduce our keynote speaker, Colonel Nate Diller, Director of AFWorks. We will then pass the mic over to Graham Warwick of Aviation Week, who will give us a media perspective on the UAM market and market opportunities. Once we're ready to get into the panel portion of the discussion, we will be joined by 5 fantastic experts from industry and federal government for a facilitated discussion. As we progress through the event, please drop any questions that you have into the Q&A section on Zoom. We will moderate those questions and reserve about 25 minutes at the end of today's event to pose the questions to the panelists. As I mentioned, we have a packed agenda, so I will go ahead and hand it over to Van Espabodi to kick us off.
Thank you, Sarah. Mic check. Very good. All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Van Espabodi. I am the co-founder of Starburst Accelerator. We started this adventure about 6 years ago to promote and support entrepreneurship and venture capital in the aviation, space, and defense sector. In the last 2 years, we've seen a remarkable shift in attention in new aircraft architecture, innovation coming from the entrepreneurs that are truly trying to push us in a new direction for urban air mobility. At Starburst, we see a lot of different things, and I personally have invested most of my career in the modernization of airspace. To me, in my previous role, innovation was moving from distance-based separation to time-based separation on final approach. So learning about electric vertical takeoff and landing systems, learning about the safety infrastructure that goes into the airspace that allows for unmanned traffic management as well as urban air mobility has been unbelievable just in the last couple of years. We've seen over hundreds of new startups that are creating enabling technologies that will support and help us adopt new ways of thinking about mobility and safety and how we move around. And today's panelists are people that we've met over the last couple of years that are very much at the forefront of what's happening, whether you're an entrepreneur yourself or curious to invest in the technologies and learn about when these investments will pay off. A lot of the leaders in allowing these technologies to come into our airspace are joining us today. So we've asked a couple of people to provide opening remarks before we move into the panel. I personally am very fond in seeing how these programs have pivoted towards a post-pandemic or post-COVID type environment where we've seen significant effect in commercial aviation, but as well as an opportunity for a lot of the technologies that have been out there to roll out and pilot these projects in this new environment. So there's a lot of interesting opportunities, and I'd like to invite our first opening remarks, our keynote speech from Colonel Nate Diller, who is involved with the DoD's Agility Prime program, was recently announced as the director of AFWorks, the Air Force's innovation hub, as well as working with the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy. So with that, Nate, I'd like to invite you to show your screen, and please tell us what is Agility Prime and what are all the exciting things you've been seeing around urban air mobility. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Van. Thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this fantastic event today. This is an area clearly that we in the Department of Defense have recently come to with a phenomenal amount of excitement. I mean, it's a great time to be in the aerospace business. Obviously, some challenges in the world right now, but this is a really a bright spot, I think, personally, because it's an opportunity and to uplift, literally, figuratively, in so many different ways across the public, from STEM and getting young folks excited in what could happen in science and technology, through aerospace, in industry, identifying new ways of building new workforce, new opportunities for that workforce. I think one thing that's been very exciting to me is to see just the diversity of groups that are coming together to bring this future into a reality sooner than I think anyone really thought. Looking across government, across academia, and across a variety of different small to large businesses. This is a great time to be in aerospace. This third revolution in aerospace. You know, if you start from the hot air of the balloons in France in the 1700s to the Wright brothers flying reciprocating engines in the early part of the last century, eventually to the jet age, and now to the potential that we see in electric aviation, the potential of cost savings, the potential, this democratization of aviation, where you're getting now an opportunity to bring flight to so many people who haven't had it, and the potential of making flight part of your everyday routine. We're excited about everything that we have seen in the industry, and we're hoping to, one, understand, is all this excitement, you know, what is it? Are we ready right now? Can we start to test this hypothesis that really we are in another revolution in aerospace, and one that has such broad potential across the Department of Defense, for us in particular, but really across the world? And so why are we doing this? Why is Agility Prime started? So Agility Prime is our effort to commercialize, to operationalize what we are expecting to be this vast commercial market in aviation. And so why is the Department of Defense interested? Well, to some degree, we see an opportunity, just broadly, the importance of establishing this industry, making sure that there is an opportunity for this industry to flourish, so that innovators really have a chance to bring this to fruition, are supported in ways that are allowing strong competitive environments and allowing those innovators with the greatest ideas to quickly move this forward and do it in a way that is scalable, that eventually gets to the numbers where, and I'll talk in more detail, where we could see this radically reshaping our urban environments. But we see so much more potential in the early stages, maybe in some of these other use cases. So for us strategically, we see a huge amount of economic opportunity for the countries that are partners that are getting involved in this. We also see, for us, additionally, besides that strategic, looking at this from a process perspective, a different way for us to look at defense acquisitions, a way where we look at budgets a little bit differently. And this is, I think, the part that's particularly interesting today, this opportunity to reduce investment risk, both for the taxpayer as well as investment risk for those entrepreneurs who are looking to fuel the next revolution in a variety of different technologies. And as the director of AFWorks, we in AFWorks are looking at a vast group of dual use technologies really across the board. You'll hear our head of acquisitions, Dr. Will Roper, talk to the fact that we are only about 20% of the overall research and development budget. Are there ways to not only expand those technologies and absorb those technologies to help us in the Department of Defense be more effective and increase the agility, but can we at the same time fuel a commercialization of those technologies faster than if the Department of Defense had not been involved? And so that process piece is the second reason why we're very interested. And then lastly, the products are one, we are the United States Air Force, and if there's something new and interesting flying, we feel like we got to at least have a little bit of understanding and ideally maybe be an important part of that. When we look at these products, the different vehicles that are out there, we see a huge potential from the hypothesis that has been posed to expand our use of this third dimension through the potential of lower maintenance, both from a cost perspective and a time perspective. And this comes from that electrification, right? Starting with some of the first principles, just the reduced number of moving parts, the reduced amount of things that actually need some type of a lubrication, and all the associated mechanical complexity and maintenance complexity that comes with that. Second, we see an opportunity for improved safety. This comes from one, potentially a future where you have more autonomous delivery if you're just delivering goods, but also an improved safety by the really impressive systems, the sensors, the autonomy, the artificial intelligence that makes these vehicles fundamentally more safe. We've leveraged some of that. I'm an F-16 pilot by trade, growing up flying the F-16. There were many cases, the F-16 that can pull 9Gs, where we would have blackouts and we would lose pilots. We now have a new system for autonomous, for the vehicle to recover, to avoid any ground collision. And we already have almost over a handful of pilots that have been saved through that. What are those ways of using this future of autonomy to make safer flight for everyone? Can we make it more affordable through the quantities that are there, with the DoD in the early stages being a small part of that, long-term using that commercial market and eventually getting to production scales that actually mirror those in the auto industry? The other piece, can we do this in a way that's not a nuisance, right? Ideally, this is not a revolution that has losers in it, that we're able to create a win by improved acoustics through what is offered with distributed propulsion, with electric propulsion. And then lastly, this ability to have anywhere, an airport, right? The idea of anyone a pilot, can we build in greater flexibility to reduce the infrastructure needs, to create some runway independence, and to provide access to the air in places that we don't necessarily have it? So seeing this huge opportunity that's out there, both for DoD and for a broader public good, the next question is, okay, how potentially could Agility Prime look to help ensure that we realize this high potential future? And we see that through three key steps in risk reduction. The first, with technological risk reduction, being able to use decades of US taxpayer investment into our ranges, into our range assets for bringing new flight vehicles to the air. we're also looking to use some of our expertise of our testers. And in doing that, reducing the overall technical risk of the vehicles that are out there. The next is regulatory risk. And this, again, as I said, I've been really excited by our partnership with NASA, with the FAA, participating very regularly in meetings with industry, and then internally, even just today on some discussions about autonomy, what that looks like, what a future regulatory environment looks like, being able interior to the Department of Defense, doing some airworthiness, that's operational risk mitigation to allow these vehicles to fly sooner, but it'll be in a very restricted environment, in an environment where there's not risk to others, right? In some of our ranges where you're flying rattlesnakes and prairie dogs, a much lower impact of risk if there is actually a challenge with one of the vehicles. By doing that regulatory piece, also opening up an opportunity for early revenue generation. By doing some of these mundane logistics tasks in these open areas for the Department of Defense, can we avoid some costs in DoD, and can we also create early revenue for some of the early use companies that are out there? And you've heard just over the last couple of weeks, some of the companies that we're partnering with that continue to advance in this Air Race 2 certification that we've suggested. So we think there is meaningful work that can happen on regulatory risk reduction and then that financial risk reduction. In the early stages, us and the Department of Defense potentially paying a little bit more for these vehicles, providing that early market. In terms of the DoD, we've had a lot of conversations with folks in other agencies in government. Can we open that market eventually to other government, eventually generating the data that now creates a vibrant commercial market? So I really, again, excited about the opportunity to have this discussion today. If you want to learn more, you can go to agilityprime.com, specifically on our use cases. We will have a webinar tomorrow talking about some of the specific use cases that we see opening this market. And you can find that webinar information at agilityprime.com. And then looking at some of the future, we've looked at 3 key areas of interest so far and have those contract solicitations out, looking at those 3 different vehicle types. Also looking at opportunities in the not so distant future to bring some of our allies and partners into this, because we know that is a critical capability for us, both from a commercial perspective in building the appropriate trade relationships there, as well as building capacity for ourselves and for our partners from a logistics perspective. So thanks for the time today. Really looking forward to the panel. And Van, thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nate. So Nate will also be joining us on the panel with some of the other panelists that we mentioned. And I know some of you already have questions, so thank you for sharing some of them. We will make sure that we capture that in just a few minutes. He brought up a very critical point around partnership with allied nations, partnership with civil agencies. The sort of the network of stakeholders involved is truly incredible. And I just want to remind everyone that we do have attendees from all around the world. This is not just the US. Right now we have over 250 people logged in. And I know there are familiar names from OEMs, from startups, from investment firms, not just in the US, but from Asia and Europe as well. So thank you all and thank you, Nate, for sharing those initial points. I'd like to pivot now and invite Graham to share his screen and talk to us about, Graham, you've been incredible at kind of following and commentating and challenging, I think, a lot of the developments you've seen when it comes to technology and innovation in our sector for years at Aviation Week. I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts as from a market insight or kind of an industry perspective, just kind of stepping back and saying, where do you think we are now, and what's it going to take with not just these stakeholders, but the rest of our network, and really adopting and moving, and especially in this type of a post-COVID type environment. So welcome your thoughts on that. Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, so thanks for this. Thanks for inviting me. So I've been covering this for at least 10 years. I remember my first interview with Mark Moore, who's obviously now at Uber, was when he was at NASA, and he produced his first single person eVTOL designs back in 2010. So this has been, like all things in aviation, this has been around for a little while, although in aviation terms, this is really 10 years is a very short period of time. But so as we came into 2020, really things were looking very promising. We were starting to see some practical vehicles in flight testing using available battery technology that could do a mission, a minimum viable product type of mission, and we'd had, the first eVTOL developer that had committed to meeting Uber's then stated target for initial commercial service in 2023. Joby Aviation had got the funding together, and they had an aircraft flying, and they said that they could be certified in production by 2023 to support that deadline. So this was in the very, the beginning of 2020. We were seeing that the technology had reached a level of practicality that the regulators had worked out, or were making a lot of progress in working out how to certify these vehicles. So Europe had a SC VTOL, which was a special condition for certifying VTOL vehicles. They've just put out the means of compliance to certify to that standard. The FAA has taken a different approach, but they've kind of identified the pieces that they need to be able to do certification. There are many vehicles that are in some form of, some way through that. So as we came into 2020, things were looking pretty good. Now, what happened, obviously, when COVID hits? I mean, in the end, we're aiming for a market, right? We're not just building these vehicles for the fun of it. There is to be a market out there. So as we're coming out of COVID, there are a lot of people are saying, is the market still there? Obviously the city's emptied out. This is all about traffic congestion. This is all about using the third dimension to get people around when they're stuck on the ground in traffic. So obviously during at the height of the lockdown for the pandemic, the roads were empty and everything like that. So as the restrictions ease, we are seeing the traffic coming back. We're seeing the congestion coming back. There are predictions that it could even be worse than it was before, because there have been traffic pattern changes for health reasons. They're taking parking places away to give people more room on sidewalks. They're doing one-way road, all sorts of things they're doing to improve, which are likely to make things worse. But at the same time, you've got a countervailing force, which is that a lot of the home working that was the solution during the lockdown looks like it's going to continue in certain parts of the world, in certain places where it's feasible. That people are either, the companies are saying, let's keep doing it, or they're saying, until you're comfortable, just stay at home. So there's going to be an extended impact from this home working. And so to me, when you look at the market pull for this, or, the market demand for this, I think that, you're likely to see a slowing in the demand, and maybe a delay in the sort of opening up of commercial service, just because we've got to get through this. We've got to get back up and running again. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think, if we push that 2023 back to 2025, there's a lot of people that would breathe a sigh of relief. It would put things back on a more normal sort of aerospace cycle, still fast by aerospace standards, but on a more normal sort of time frame. And it would allow the various pieces to kind of get aligned, that not just the vehicle and certification, but also the infrastructure and the airspace. If we had another couple of years, nobody would really mind, I suspect. But it would also probably mean that some other parts of the world might have a chance to catch up with the US, which has kind of led so far. I mean, China is already approving commercial operations with eVTOLs cargo at the moment, but they're on a path to approve passenger operations with eVTOLs. South Korea just announced a roadmap to get to limited commercial service by 2023. So the likelihood is, even if we have a bit of a delay, the rest of the world could start to catch up with the US, which is an issue that when we come to Agility Prime and the role that NASA plays, that's really where that comes in there. So that's the COVID impact on the market. The COVID impact in the industry is that again, the restrictions did delay or slow flight testing. Several of the eVTOL developers, the startups, which is not able to fly on schedule or had to pause their flying or whatever. Now that's beginning to ease off, but these vehicles are very software intensive, and all the companies I've talked to said that they would continue to work all the software side of things during the lockdown, and they're ready to come back when they're able to come back and run fast. So, and also they also report that they were able to work really productively with the FAA here in the US anyway, and so I suspect in Europe too, through the virtual means, during the lockdown. So we haven't got the hours on the vehicles, but we've still been making progress coming out of that. And again, and another for the industry, another impact is that traditionally venture capital during economic downturns, it's harder to find. We're into and going to continue in the economic downturn for some time, and particularly for startups. My feeling is that if for the startups that have got significant funding rounds still ahead of them, it's going to be difficult. And I would say that if they didn't have the funding in place before COVID hit to get to a full-scale vehicle, then they are probably going to miss the first wave of UAM. There will be a second wave, but my feeling is you're going to have a second-generation vehicle if you're not going to be in that first wave, and you're going to be on because of funding. You're going to have a second-generation vehicle when you come in, because the first wave guys are not going to move over. They're going to be fighting to keep that market. So you're going to have to, those second wave eVTOL are going to have a second generation vehicle. So as I said, we were making good progress on all of the key challenges, the technical challenge, the batteries, the motors, all that sort of thing, the regulatory challenge. We were beginning to get some real discussion going on airspace integration and infrastructure availability was all really beginning to tackle. And to me, I think what COVID has really focused us on is what was always out there, the twin elephants in the room, which was on one hand is market adoption. Will people fly in these things? And the other one is public acceptance. Will the people not flying in these things accept them flying over them? And the two are linked, but they are the toughest problems that this industry faces. And as far as market adoption is concerned, we have to be clear here. For a UAM to work, it is a ride-sharing experience. It's not a ride-hailing experience. Uber is a ride-hailing company. A very small part of its business is ride-sharing. It has acknowledged how hard it is to get people to ride-share. It can only get harder to get people to ride-share after COVID. We're seeing that mass transit usage is not coming back as fast as other forms of transportation. So, the question in front of us is, will people treat riding in an air taxi like flying in an airliner where you do ride share, or will they treat it like riding in a car where fundamentally people don't seem to be that willing to ride share? At the same time, there is some belief with a little bit of evidence to support it that private aviation, particularly as the airlines are slow to rebuild their networks, slow to reconnect some of the smaller cities, what we generally call private aviation, which is business jet, charter aircraft, general aviation, smaller aircraft, fixed wing air taxis, etc. I think, there is some anecdotal evidence, a little bit of hard evidence coming in that there might be greater use of that private aviation until people's comfort level comes back and until those smaller communities are reconnected by the airlines. And what that does is that creates that operator base, or builds that operator base of Part 1 to 35 operators of short-range regional operations that we really need to be there for when these vehicles come, not just the urban air taxis, but the sub-regional electric CTOL or electric STOL type of vehicles that are coming. We need that operator base to fly between these small airports. So there may be that in these next few, 18 months, as the airlines rebuild, there may be some strengthening of that network that then means that when the new vehicles come, they can lay on top of that and we can build on some of those services. So we got all these various things going on. So how do you close? There are a lot of gaps to be closed. And closing the gap, that public acceptance, that public adoption, they really need to be convinced that the vehicles are quiet for public acceptance and safe for public adoption. And really, the point we've reached in this industry is we need flight data. We need people to start flying vehicles flying multiple vehicles and flying multiple vehicles many, many flights, so we can start to get the data that not only helps the regulators to refine and define the standards for these vehicles, but actually begins to get the data out into the community that says these vehicles are safe. I want to use the example of delivery drones because Google's Wing literally took a year out of its program. It was moving along at quite a pace with the delivery, with testing the technology, and it just went quiet for a year. Well, during that year, it basically went off and it put thousands of flights onto its delivery drones, just off by itself, just put thousands of flights on its delivery drones. By doing that, they were able to take the data back to the FAA, and the result of that was they were the first to get the FAA approval to fly drones over people's heads. That is crucial for drone delivery. You can't do it if you can't fly over people. So that data was essential. That was the answer, and that's what they did. Now they still, when they went and deployed operationally, they still learned things. They learned that people don't like drones flying at low level over their heads, so they had to learn some operating things on top. But the vehicle was safe before it went out there. So I think we're heading into that phase now where we just have to get data, and that's where Agility Prime and NASA's national campaign come in. Really, they've come along at almost like the right moment, because they support that getting of the data. They involve independent parties in the getting of that data, and they are sort of agnostic to who they work with. And I think they will help us get through this phase till the market recovers and resumes the pull. And when that pull resumes, we will have more mature vehicles that are about ready to go out into the market.
Brilliant, Graham. Thank you. Your insights I always enjoy, and thank you for sharing that. It's a perfect transition and segue into introducing our panelists, which I will hand over to Sarah to make introductions. But really, the case study on Google Wing, the story that entrepreneurs are out there collecting flight data, people are out there breaking things, flying things. Like, this is really exactly what I wanted to dive into. So thank you so much, Graham. Thank you, Nate. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Van. As Van mentioned, there are a lot of points that Graham made that we are eager to discuss on the panel. So without further ado, I will ask the panelists to go ahead and show their video and welcome them to the stage. Hi, Baruch, we can see your video. Colonel Diller, Pam, Tassilo, and Star. Great. So as we transition into this panel, I'd like to first give each of you the opportunity to introduce yourself, say a little bit about your organization's role in UAM, just to set a little bit of context for how you each relate to each other in the UAM ecosystem, and just kick off with a 1-minute intro. We'll start with Star. Oh, you're muted still.
Sorry, forgot to
Perfect.
unmute. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Thanks. Hi, yeah, first name is Star, last name is Ginn, and I am the Advanced Air Mobility National Campaign Lead at NASA. I've started my career in electric propulsion about the 2011 timeframe, and have worked the hardware side of it. And I come from a flight research background, so I have about 24 years of flying unique aircraft. And so understanding the flight critical systems of these, which is like the distributed electric propulsion and energy storage, was really where, we were trying to highlight what are the gaps in those technologies to put them on, a vehicle safely, and keep the level of robustness for the aviation industry. Most of these components, right, have not survived on airplanes, but more ground-based vehicles. So they need higher power. They need to be lighter, and it's really a clean sheet design for a lot of the industry. But as we're working like X57 to figure out how to help FAA with safety cases of testing these individual components on the vehicle, NASA decided we got to really look at the entire operation, because we need a kind of a whole sales change in how we're going to manage the airspace with the numbers of vehicles that they're talking about deploying. So we're going to have to get to a network-based airspace system that assists the FAA in their current roles of airspace operation. And we started looking at, how could we take the idea of UTM and expand it, and it's got to be able to do more, right? We have to actually operate above 500 feet in the national airspace, interacting with other vehicles that aren't using a network-based airspace system. And how do we handle contingencies? From the vehicle characterization standpoint, how do we look at helipads, or maybe we need, vertipads, different kinds of infrastructure. What's the most efficient routing for these vehicles, knowing that they have limited energy storage? What do their approaches and landings look like? So we're taking an operations look, and we have the FAA partnered with us for the last year and a half to look at what we should be testing in those operations to inform all lines of business simultaneously in the FAA. So we're not trying to solve these problems serially, like first figure out how to certify a vehicle, then figure out how the vehicle is going to use the infrastructure, and then how we're going to integrate in airspace. So it's a much bigger undertaking than we've done on other NASA projects, but just really excited to have the partnerships from industry we have right now. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Star. Next, let's go to Tassilo of Lilium.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having us. I'm Tassilo. I'm leading public and regulatory affairs. So this is FAA liaison, this is business development with public enterprises, and this is the public affairs side with Lilium. It's really great to see how much momentum there is and continues to be in and around the emerging UAM industry, continues to be despite COVID. And in the case of Lilium, almost quite the opposite, actually. We just raised more than $250 million since COVID started to hit us, including from Bailey Gifford, early Tesla backers who just joined the group of our investors just this past week. At the same time, actually also interesting developments. We have been easing our hiring processes a bit so that we can bring people on board also without on-site interviews that obviously wouldn't have been possible in the past few months. So it may be interesting to hear for you that we've hit 400 and by now even 450 also during that COVID time. And as many of you are aware, the team did not only significantly grow in size to what is probably the largest eVTOL developing entity in the world, but also in terms of depth and experience over the past few years. Yves Jensi is maybe a good example. He has been leading the quality side of the A350 program with Airbus, joined us last week, now in charge of our program and supply chain, actually, and we will discuss a bit of that later throughout the session, I think. And many other champions from NASA, Boeing, Airbus, and actually even beyond aviation. And all of that, obviously, on basis of a pretty unique aircraft concept. Some of you may have seen it in terms of the canard configuration, in terms of the 36 engines distributed almost perfectly around the center of gravity of the aircraft, and therefore highly efficient, becoming what we are positive that to be one of the, if not the strongest aircraft in the market. And when I mean strong, not only in terms of its range, but also in terms of the noise profile. So very happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion, also to the Q&A. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tassilo. Let's go over to Baruch next. Baruch, just a 1-minute short intro if you could. I know we have a lot of questions to get to.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. My name is Baruch Abraham. I work in the FAA's Next Gen organization, and more specifically, I manage our advanced concepts branch, where my team leads a lot of efforts related to unmanned aircraft as well as unmanned aircraft initiatives. More specifically with urban air mobility, we are leading the development of what the initial stages of the urban air mobility concept will be for the next few years in the initial parts of those operations as we go from the current manned operations as well as the UTM been doing to what that looks like with a passenger carrying, slowly getting into more and more automated vehicles and operating in more urban areas. So that I've been working urban air mobility for a couple of years now, but supporting the UAS traffic management initiatives and some of the systems engineering and testing we've been leading on the FAA's Next Gen organization.
Thank you, Baruch. And Pam from Hyundai.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. So I'm Pamela Cohen. I am the Vice President of Global Operations and Strategy for Hyundai Air Mobility, which is essentially a very long title to say I run the business functions for Hyundai's aircraft company around the world. I think you guys kind of know us pretty well as a car company, but we made our big debut coming into the UAM market at CES this year when we unveiled our SA1 prototype, as well as our partnership with Uber Elevate. So lots of other exciting things going on behind the scenes for the company in terms of aircraft development, as well as UAM ecosystem development. And I'm very excited to chat with all of you guys about it today on the panel.
Thank you. And of course, we also have Colonel Nate Diller rejoining us. So Colonel Diller, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to rejoin. I'd like to start off the panel by touching on something that Graham brought up in his opening remarks from a media perspective, and that's the similarity that we see between where we were a couple of years ago with the small UAS market and where we are today with UAM. There are so many parallels from the technology perspectives, consumer readiness, how are we going to regulate and grant airspace access to these new entrants? So I'm wondering if, Baruch, you can kick us off by talking a little bit about maybe what some of those lessons learned were from working with the small drone market and how that might shape how both FAA and then over to you, Star, for NASA, are going to engage on UAM going forward.
Sure. Yes, there is definitely a lot of parallels we can leverage here, and it's actually quite a lot of the lessons we've learned through the UTM. The small UAS work is absolutely being translated and reflected into how we're approaching urban air mobility. I think first, just from the engagement with the industry stakeholders and the operators and the that are looking to operate in this environment, we absolutely recognize and have learned a lesson that close engagement and to make sure we have a good understanding of what capabilities they bring to the table, what the type of operations are looking like, and their implications on our air traffic management systems is one that we're leveraging heavily. So for urban air, for UTM, for example, when the FAA and specifically our organization got involved, a good bit of the groundwork and the foundation had already been built with NASA and industry partnerships. So the FAA did have to do a little bit of catching up. I feel we've done a good job over the years now, including the publications of our concept of operations for UTM. Well, for urban air mobility, we're trying to get ahead of that. So we're actually, right from the beginning, we're working alongside NASA in the development of the concept. We're also taking a look at, in addition to the concepts that are looking at a little bit further down the future, what does that transition look like? So the FAA is working it from the initial concept perspective out the gate. Industry standard that are being developed, whether that's through organizations like ASTM or others. I think we recognize the value of leveraging those, necessarily being prescriptive in the way we are looking to address these new types of operations. Because I think at the end of the day, these vehicles, unmanned vehicles, and the way we're looking to operate them does not fit in with the traditional air traffic management we have in place. So I think there's been a good shift in line of thinking in leveraging that public and private extensive involvement in the testing from the beginning through NASA. So maybe that's a good pause there, and see if Star can add to that, and we can come back to it if necessary.
Yeah, it's like to add, so obviously FAA and NASA have been working on the biggest challenge for unmanned vehicles is detect and avoid. We still don't, you're still working on what's the minimum performance for those types of technologies. And it's quite a lot of work to try to prove a safety case of having a no chase COA and an unmanned airplane operating in the national airspace. So I still feel like we have a large hurdle there. Now we're pivoting to, not only do we have to solve that problem, but now we want these vehicles to be robust enough to carry people and not just cargo. And so that means they're going to have the equivalent safety of a human piloted vehicle. I think the way that we're going to figure out the operations and how all lines of business, the FAA are going to have to make some changes for UAM is really going to be with the early piloted vehicles. I mean, to get an operation at real airports, around real density airspace, so that we can understand the challenges of moving to a network-based airspace service amongst the other vehicles flying. That certainly is going to have to start with a piloted vehicle who's using the existing rules of the airspace as we kind of do a ride along airspace network capability and understanding how we're going to deal with contingencies in the terminal base operations. We definitely are interested in working with the cargo delivery or the remotely piloted types of vehicle in the national campaign. But I'm sure those operations, for now, as we're testing national campaign, will have to be done in more restricted environments that those vehicles are already testing in, versus trying to get them, at an airport in a Class D airspace even. So we're trying to work with the FAA to come up with some different routes at real airports and real airspace for this first national campaign. So our piloted vehicles will be the first to test out the real airport thing, but certainly we'll look to using the more restricted ranges for the remotely piloted vehicles.
Perfect. Thank you, Star. And I think that one of the things that you touched on is that this is going to have to happen in phases, where maybe first it's with manned, maybe first it's in specific areas. And I think that on the commercial side, the eVTOL manufacturers are also looking at phases for market entry. Pamela, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how Hyundai is thinking about those phases and where the market may materialize first and maybe where some things will come later.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a little bit different from some of the other eVTOL companies that you're going to see out there. Our timelines aren't quite as aggressive as some of the other players that are aiming for 2023 to 2025. We're actually looking to be what Graham was speaking to a little bit earlier on in this call, but that second generation vehicle that's going to come in a little bit later. So we're looking at some of the later opportunities around 2028 to 2030 to really commercialize our offerings inside of the market. So that obviously changes the way that we think about where we want to partner. And a lot of it comes from I think, a little bit of a different mindset. So what we're looking for right now when we think about market opportunities is areas around the world that are willing to have very in-depth partnerships and conversations about what mobility means for them and what are the current challenges that their communities feel that they see right now, and how can we co-develop the right transportation solutions and environmental solutions in order to help address them. So I think that a lot of the eVTOL players that you're going to see in the market right now, they're looking for quick market access. Where are the places that are really excited to pilot this technology today or tomorrow, or best case scenario yesterday? Whereas I think the way that we're looking at market development is kind of on 4 major prongs. So the first one that we look at is, where is the biggest need? UAM is going to look different in every city and every region around the world. And the best UAM systems are going to be ones that are designed backward from what the community actually needs. And then technology is made to fit those needs, as opposed to trying to have technology find a problem. So our first kind of stage gate is, where is the major need and what does that mean for technology? The second major stage gate that we use is strategic alignment. So what are the major things that they're looking for? Because there are many different transportation solutions for different mobility problems. So where are the places that are aligned with what we believe our technology value proposition is in terms of congestion busting, but as well as in terms of green technology? And where can we find those right partners where those mobility needs and those community needs align with what our vision is of equity and access and green technology? And then the third big issue that we use as our phase gate is, okay, we find a place that has a need as a market. We have a place that has strategic alignment with us in terms of what we believe the future of mobility can look like and how we play into it. And the third one then is, what is their openness to engage with us? And I think one of the big things that we have had to remind ourselves of sometimes is, we are super excited about UAM technology, but there are very few cities and states around the world that have a dedicated UAM team. And it's not because they're not visionary, and it's not because they don't see the promise of this technology. It's because this is one really interesting solution to one of many, many problems that cities are facing right now in terms of how they are best able to serve their citizenry. So we look for folks that they don't necessarily need a dedicated UAM team, but are open to engaging on key issues like zoning and land use and public acceptance and community engagement. And then our final phase gate that we use on this is, once we found a couple of those, the best ones are the ones that are willing to meaningfully commit and meaningfully partner. And that sometimes comes in the form of co-investment in things like infrastructure, but other times can be as simple as are willing to engage with us on a public engagement campaign with their community groups in order to make sure that we have the right mobility solutions. So I know that this process looks very different for different eVTOL players just based on their timelines and their technologies. But at least from the Hyundai perspective, we really take a community first approach. And so as we think about our market opportunities, we really start with that community lens and work backward from there to down select who are the right partners to meaningfully go the distance with in terms of finding the right mobility solutions.
And Tassilo, I know that Lilium has been a little bit more of a first mover in the eVTOL market. So maybe you have a different perspective on answering the question of kind of how you see the UAM market unfolding and where you kind of see earlier opportunities.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, and obviously I was just about to say, obviously we are a bit of an example of what another timeline could look like versus what Pamela had just suggested in terms of what you're planning with Hyundai. But at the same time, interestingly, Sarah, the conclusions are not entirely different in terms of we also backsolve very much from where's real demand, right? And also to the question that I saw in the Q&A, we can deep dive into that maybe later by Luis, right? Why is Lilium interested not only in the inner city, but also in the intra-city case? Yes, because there we can provide a meaningful time saving and really contribute and densify mobility networks in a way that wouldn't be possible without eVTOL. So demand and also the whole community perspective are really key also for us. At the same time, given that we will enter the market significantly earlier than the numbers that Pamela suggested, obviously we will follow a bit more the staged approach that Star was actually pointing out, right? So at the beginning, it will be rather traditional operations in a way. Obviously, that is only possible if you design both the aircraft and the operations in a way. So it will be possible, but in our case, and most of you will be aware of that, it's a fully certified aircraft. It's traditionally certified air crew, physically on board. And as Star was pointing out, we will comply with rules of the air in the initial phase of, or traditional rules of the air in the initial phase of operations, no matter what, even if this then restricts actually the capabilities where and how and at what frequencies, et cetera, to operate. But obviously then there is the scale up age of UAM, where we densify networks, where we densify frequencies of operations, and then basically the whole ecosystem will be concerned and can contribute, be it on the ATM, UTM side, potentially even also regulatory change. But actually very, very interestingly, all the regulators, and I think FAA, NASA here on the panel are great examples of that, but also globally are extremely open to that, right? Once we, as an industry, will have convinced the regulators of the levels of safety, both of the aircraft as well as the operations that we will be establishing, I think it will be literally only a matter of time before we can agree together and develop together actually the future in terms of how these operations will look like and will be regulated.
Thank you. And Colonel Diller, I know that Agility Prime is really working to stimulate an early market for UAM and for the vehicles themselves, and looking at timelines that are closer in and earlier in the 2020s. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the Agility Prime timeline and looking to kind of create that vehicle readiness for military use cases as well.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. So our timeline really intentionally was to align as best we could to those early adopters, those early developers, with the intent of us being an early adopter. And so when you look at what we have published and what we feel like we're still on track for, is a fielding of vehicles by 2023. And so to that end, certainly COVID has created some challenges, though. It's interesting, we do this less so with our smaller companies that are out there, but some of our larger companies in other parts of the defense business have actually shown over the last couple of months, in some cases, actually moving ahead of schedule in some areas based on some of the bizarre efficiencies that we've all found. We probably would not all be visiting together were it not for COVID right now. And so we do intend to continue to push forward towards that. The lines of effort that are necessary to do that, obviously, from a contracting perspective, we have a series of those contracts that are moving forward, as we have announced over the last few weeks. As we go from that point, the airworthiness is critical, and so we have established a lot of the discussions that are moving forward now in the relatively near term with the OEMs, as well as with NASA and FAA in conjunction for those discussions. And then the next piece of that then is our flight test. And so we have a very robust flight test team, both on the flight test side, but as well as providing access to some of the wind tunnels, ranges, the climate labs. And so we feel like, at least for the time being, we still have a decent path to get a good number of vehicles flying and fielded for those early use cases, right? Of again, relatively mundane logistics, but some flights, again, the need just to generate data, to generate cycles on these aircraft, so that we can continue down this collaborative campaign of learning towards that 2023 fielding. And for the time being, we feel like that's still within reach.
Thank you. And I'd like to pivot the conversation now a little bit more toward vehicle technology and some of the enabling technology. Starburst, in this role it has as an accelerator in the industry, has scouted dozens of battery companies and companies that work on LiDAR solutions. And we recognize that the UAM market isn't just going to be for the startups that build end-to-end vehicles or the established players that build end-to-end vehicles, and that there are a lot of components that need to be threaded together to make all of this work. And so I'm wondering if, Pamela, if you can talk a little bit about how Hyundai looks to partner with some of those startups who are forming a new part to the supply chain to evolve with some of the companies that have the past performance and the experience working in a highly regulated industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of our biggest focuses strategically is creating these partnerships. And like you said, a lot of them are with suppliers inside of the industry, inside of the industrial base. Some of them are more ecosystem partnerships with state and local governments or infrastructure providers and financiers. But specifically inside of the supply chain, one of the big things, and I think this is what Starburst has been doing a really great job with, is that our current industrial base of existing aerospace and defense manufacturing and technology doesn't actually have all of the solutions that we need in order to enable eVTOLs. And they definitely don't have it at a cost competitive price or in a modular way that allows us to have the innovation that we're going to need to keep pace with how technology changes over time. So there's actually a really big opportunity here for a lot of smaller players to be able to be more agile, be more nimble, and be able to partner with some of the larger players in order to actually get their technologies expressed on platforms. I think there's kind of three big areas that right now we think are some pretty good areas for startups to be looking at. So as you said, batteries and propulsion systems is definitely one where there are a bunch of key technologies and components that are actually ripe for smaller companies to be able to develop technology with and then have it commercialized either through a partnership or through an acquisition by some of the larger players that are more experienced in production and manufacturing. The second really big one is AI and autonomy, especially for the software components of this, for DAA and automated mission management. There are huge gaps in the market right now in terms of actually getting reliable technology that can do the types of missions that we're going to need to do to the fidelity that we're going to need to do them. And software in particular is a really great niche to be able to have a smaller company come in with excellent ideas and excellent programming and be able to be snapped up either through a partnership or through an acquisition by some of the bigger players to get them expressed on our platforms. And the third one's actually in data analytics and communications technologies. So obviously there's a big question that we have around the reliability and availability of spectrum in order to support the types of operations that we need. But there's also a lot of questions right now in terms of protocols, in terms of robust data transfer and robust data communications. Another great place where commercial technologies are actually well ahead of aerospace and defense technologies in many ways. And it's not necessarily a capital intensive part of the market to get into. So these are just kind of three top of mind ones that come to me when you ask the question. But there are a lot of these areas where there are places that don't have significantly high barriers to entry, where smaller companies may do a much better job and are much more agile at developing these technologies. And larger companies like Hyundai, as well as many other ones in the space, are really excited to partner with them, either in terms of a partnership where we can help educate them and get them up to aviation grade in order for production, where we could produce those technologies for them once they create them, or where we can even bring them in-house should we think that they're critical enough to our supply chain. So overall, I think there's lots of opportunities. And on this call, I know there's lots of Starburst companies that are here. If you guys have a really great idea that you think is going to be really critical, please reach out to me, reach out to my global head of partnerships, Adam Slepian on LinkedIn. We love getting to know you and talking to you guys about this and helping to develop the industrial base that's going to make all of us successful.
Thank you. And while we're on the topic of working with startups and what we can learn from some of the early work that startups have done in this space, Star, I know we talked earlier last week about some of the lessons learned you see that startups are acquiring and the value that has to potential partners longer term. I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, what was interesting when I started to advocate with NASA, and NASA's natural partners at that time were large aerospace companies. All of them were kind of, standoffish, didn't really see how this small airplane market, was going to compete against large, regional aircraft. And a lot of the research, NASA was doing was around those larger aircraft. And so it was the gumption of these small businesses that said, you know what, I want to try and see if I can do it. And it was good for NASA because we had small budgets, because it wasn't like they didn't quite believe in it yet. So we scrounge up our money and get these small businesses to start working with us to figure out, the gaps in the components. We have tons of lessons learned. One of my requests to industry is, we have got to start all sharing lessons learned. I mean, why should everybody have to reinvent the wheel, when it comes to safety critical aspects of the vehicle design? we want this industry to be safe for everybody. So by not sharing some of these things that, is going to help somebody not become on the front page of the news would be great. Luckily, X57, because it is a government funded project, has a tech page where they publish all of their lessons learned. And if you look, I mean, I crack up when I looked at LinkedIn, but how many people are jumping between small businesses? When they gather those lessons learned, they are so valuable to another company who's trying to start up and doesn't want to take all that time to learn those lessons. And I think I see, the larger OEMs, they're kind of sitting back and waiting for that knowledge base of those lessons learned to really grow from the small businesses. And then like Pamela was saying, the larger companies will start snatching up those small businesses. So for us to maybe do that fail early, fail fast mentality, you get data out there. The small businesses are just like a perfect avenue for that. But I will say that there is a spot, like Pamela had mentioned, when you do need to transfer those new ideas to the larger aviation industry that understands the level, like the manufacturing detail, the quality assurance, the things that go in to give you that 10 to the -9 reliability in your components, is something that isn't really, it's that information is not really in the small businesses, right? They're looking at doing new things that haven't been done before. So the joining of these small businesses with the larger manufacturers is going to be key.
And Tassilo, I see you nodding quite a bit while Star was talking. I wonder if you want to continue to touch on that.
Yes, both Star and also Pamela's point, right? Especially when it comes to the potential for nimbleness in the supply chain through startup innovation. Also fully agree actually with the three focus areas that Pamela was pointing out. At the same time, a bit of a comfortable situation, especially here where we are being located in Munich. There is such a strong ecosystem of existing supply in aerospace and defense and automobile that we can take advantage of. And again, here, a bit to the philosophy of our entry into market scenario and the design of our aircraft, we try and will fly actually at the beginning as much as possible with existing technology that we are actually already flight testing. At the same time, obviously, when we then transition more and more into a state of remotely piloted, finally also autonomous operations, it will look different. And I think the opportunity for startups is definitely there. Actually, one other dimension is also the broader ecosystem beyond the very vehicle hardware and equipment, right? Think of infrastructure startups, think of MRO and leaner MRO processes than we have seen in the past, maybe in aviation, for example. All the software also that Pamela was referring to in terms of how do we take advantage of all the data that we're collecting there to optimize also operations from a commercial point of view as well. So it's quite a few interesting angles where we are very, very happy to be in touch with top-notch developers, no matter actually if it is legacy or if it is startup projects.
Hey, Sarah, I wanted to make a note that I accidentally hit the dismiss button on one of the questions that I thought was a good question, but I had to do with infrastructure. And so I just wanted to say one of the things for the startups, one of the things is infrastructure. If you look at the timeline and the cost of bringing high power to any location, it's going to be long and costly. And I'm not sure exactly who the people are that are going to be interested in putting in that kind of capital. So I've been looking at companies who just, think of a fuel truck, right? You got fuel trucks that drive around an airport and fill up airplanes. How do we get portable charging where, and it doesn't have to, and I'm not saying like lithium ion, but or it could be any kind of energy storage system, but it's portable. It doesn't have to be plugged into shore power. It can come around, charge vehicles, and then go off and charge itself once it's depleted, its energy from charging, and then, get more trucks circling back around. I really think that is going to be a near-term solution as these vehicles, don't have the infrastructure. And if the infrastructure exists, then that just sticks them to, only one route or a couple airports they can use to do this. So something for you guys to consider. Sorry, I dismissed the question.
That's okay. Thank you for answering it. And I think it's a really good point too, that it's not just the vehicles, but this entire ecosystem of technology that needs to be threaded together. And for the UAM market to continue to be viable, you have to have a certain level of ubiquity on things like power. So making sure that we have all of those pieces in place so that we can make sure that the market comes together is critical. I wanted to let you know we had planned about 25 minutes for Q&A at the end, so we are going to compress that and do about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. The audience has been active and submitting questions in the Q&A chat. So I'd like to go over to a couple of those questions now. There were a couple of questions, Colonel Diller, on Agility Prime and the funding behind Agility Prime over the next 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. And I know that you have a few different tools to allocate funding to startups and partners, but if you could touch a little bit on the funding behind AFWERX and future plans, I think that would help the audience.
Yeah, certainly. And there's another question a little further down talking a bit about the SBIR program, which we also have parts of that under the new AFWERX that was recently stood up over the last just over the last week. So in terms of the funding, I can talk specifically to the pieces that are out, as part of public record. There has been up to $35 million allocated for Agility Prime over the course of a couple of years. That's for 19 and 20. For 21 and beyond, those are still to be determined, both internal to the Air Force, and obviously it is the Congress that provides the funding. So that's kind of the baseline. We have also, to answer the question a bit, a variety of mechanisms that are out there. When we started this was very much, and this is a bit in the way that AFWERX is intending to do things, to be able to go have access and provide some opportunities in the commercial space where, historically DoD has not had much of an opportunity. And in particular with Agility Prime, not just, initially giving a little bit of funding, which is what those, right, it was an ad hoc start with many of the small companies that are out there. When we do that internal to AFWERX, when we start to see that there is kind of this critical mass of technology providers coupled with some type of an operator need, then the idea is that we can then create the connective tissue that's necessary to take the project from a series of small business opportunities, including this in a way that allows larger companies as well. And so that's specifically what we've done with Agility Prime, in terms of eventually getting to larger funding. And we expect to have some of those announcements on some of the more notable funding as time goes on. To answer one other question that often comes up in the same vein with Agility Prime, not necessarily specifically funding the research and development. You can all imagine, when we do acquisitions in the Department of Defense, one of our top priorities is to make sure that we are being equitable in doing that. And that comes a bit at a price, just the challenge of doing due diligence with hundreds of companies that are out there. Doing that due diligence in a rigorous way that provides equitable research and development across all of those is an approach that we have chosen, at least for the time being, to pass on, and instead focus on the near term companies that are in a position to fly very soon. As we've done that, there's been some questions that this may give some opportunities for those first to market. I would say that they're also having some of the challenge, right? When the younger companies, if you will, were at this point, they didn't necessarily have quite the same support network that was there. So we feel like, the current contracting mechanism is open through 2025 that should allow opportunities for those fast followers, both big companies, small companies, the smaller companies being able to leverage the small business program, specifically what it was for, right? Take small ideas and turn them into large, globally competitive businesses. And so we're trying to realize that vision that was created by the US Congress, while at the same time making sure there's opportunities for those larger companies, both domestically and then potentially internationally, as we start to build this ecosystem. So the follow-on funding, a bit to be determined yet, as is often the case with defense budgeting.
Thank you. And there's another question in here. We talk a lot about certification. We talk a lot about the vehicle technology and some of the infrastructure technology. But we recognize that certification is one regulatory hurdle. But Baruch, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the progress that's being made in ensuring airspace access for UAM and for eVTOLs. Can you talk a little bit about the progress there and what we can expect going forward?
Yeah. Yeah, airspace access and the management of it is not you don't have a shiny prototype you can put out there, right? But it is absolutely a big part of the work we're doing actually in our organization. The push we've been making is that we understand the vehicles are maturing and they are maturing at different rates. The readiness of those vehicles and certifications may differ, but at the end of all of it, as soon as those vehicles are ready, whatever pace they are at, our objective is that the airspace management tools and the airspace management policies and rules and regulations are going to be in place to do that. So I think that plays a big part in the work we're doing. We're taking a look at those technologies. I think it also goes to the breadth of the different components from industry where they could play a role in. Pamela brought up some of the artificial intelligence and the machine learning. Those are the types of things we're taking into consideration when we're looking at the future of airspace management. And not just about, when it applies to an operator and how they manage their fleet, but we're looking at that as a mechanism to manage our traffic operations. We recognize today's visual flight rules and instrument flight rules are not going to be adequate and applicable when we're talking about urban air mobility and a lot of the unmanned operations we're talking in the near future here. So how do we enable that? It's been a big focus of the work we're doing, and I think we are continuing to build on what we've seen from industry with how they're approaching industry and NASA, and how we've been working the UTM issues and how then that translates to urban air mobility. I think it's not going to be a one size fits all. We fully recognize the need for a performance-based approach in the way we implement rules and regulations and in the way we manage traffic. And it was also mentioned earlier, it's not going to be the same type of operations and the same type of vehicles across the country or across the world. I think each different industry area or market is going to have that unique element. And I think approaching it with a performance-based perspective is how we're looking at it. And we are doing our best to make sure that our airspace policies are ready and in place before the vehicles.
I think you're on mute, Sarah.
Thank you. Yes, so I was going to say in the Q&A, we had a couple of questions from Luis that I believe Tassilo had mentioned wanting to comment on. If it was a different panelist, please correct me. But there are a few questions on seeing big signature projects from companies like Airbus and Boeing start to wind down a little bit, and others, of course, starting to spin up. So I wonder if anyone would like to touch on that evolution a little bit and kind of where we see the waxing and waning in some of these bigger projects.
That sounds like something Graham could probably answer since he does all that research.
Graham, would you like to join the Q&A and
Okay. Yeah, it is very interesting. I mean, obviously the major companies are going through a triage process at the moment. I mean, it's all about cash conservation. I mean, they're trying to keep their businesses afloat. So we saw that Airbus and Rolls put the EFAN-X, which was a large airplane, that was a regional aircraft size hybrid electric. So they decided not to go to flight with that. Now they're going to finish out the ground testing, so they'll gain some knowledge from that. But at the moment, they're not taking it to flight. Now Boeing, we don't really know the internal workings of Boeing. I mean, you know, Aurora flew the PAV, the Pegasus, but it had an accident, and they've not flown it again. But they have joined with Wisk, and they're doing the Cora flight test, the Cora program with Kitty Hawk and Wisk. So I think there is no doubt that these companies remain interested, they remain engaged, but we have got 2 years of kind of triaging and rebuilding of R&D priorities to go through. The Airbus CTO is going to be talking later this week at AIAA Aviation, so it'll be interesting what she says, because in Europe, even after the EFAN-X decision, Europe has come out strongly saying that they need to see more research into future, more efficient aircraft. So France is putting money into that. And Airbus is talking about hydrogen and other things like that. So you know, the answer is we will know in a year or so's time what these big companies are doing, but they are clearly not going to walk away from this in the longer term. They may reorganize their priorities, but they're not walking away from this.
Right. Thank you, Graham, and thank you for rejoining us for a Q&A session. I think that was a really helpful answer. We do have another question for Lilium in the Q&A. The question is around Lilium moving away from urban operations and pivoting a little bit towards inner city connections and longer flights. Was it considered that urban operations were possibly not as feasible or not as profitable for some reason? Can you talk a little bit about the decision there?
Yeah, there's maybe a two-folded answer here. The practical answer is actually we will be flying intra-city because we're capable of doing it, right, from a range perspective. And most of the eVTOLs obviously will not, given their multi-copter kind of designs. So we've been basically investing so much into the capability to transition into traditional cruise flight and all the efficiency that comes with it, that obviously we would like to take advantage of that. The more theoretical part of the answer is, and this goes a bit back to what we had discussed previously, actually, that those potentially are also the more interesting use cases. Actually, we do very, very thorough analyses of where we can really add value, both from a connectivity and time-saving point of view, and even beyond, right? So where can we really establish connectivity between two points where otherwise it wouldn't be possible within short timeframes and based on relatively slim infrastructure investment costs. And oftentimes the sweet spot is rather than on the longer haul flight by eVTOL standards, as opposed to the hop within a city, because you are breaking the mobility chain and therefore the passenger will always lose time, and uncertainty will also be growing when there is a first and a last mile. But still you can do that from inner city to inner city. And actually there's one other almost counterintuitive kind of thought here, because the two are not mutually exclusive, right? Only because you're flying from one city to the other over a longer distance, that doesn't mean that you can't perform flights within a city where the time saving can be established at the same time, right? Counterintuitive in as much as people would think sometimes that the copter kind of eVTOLs are specializing in the short haul flights and therefore can do it more efficiently. But actually, It's quite the contrary. We can also do the short flight more efficiently because we are faster, we have a higher payload, and also lower noise, so can go maybe a bit more directly into the city center. So basically, it's not a shift in strategy, but it's just a combination of potentially two strong use cases.
Thank you. And I want to acknowledge that we are running up on time, and I wish we could continue to talk about this all day. But I know that you all have very busy jobs to get back to. I wanted to thank you all for joining. I think that the questions around the UAM market have shifted from being more, is this real, to what is the right strategy for investing in each individual company based on where their market entry point might be and the technological considerations and regulatory considerations associated with each piece. So it's become a very diverse market with different strategies in play. And thank you all for helping us stay informed on all of those different considerations. I will pass it over to Van now to go ahead and close us out.
Thank you, Sarah. Round of applause virtually for Sarah Sugarman for moderating such a wonderful panel. Thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Baruch, good to see you again. Pam, great to see you again. Nate, good to see you again. Tassilo, great to meet you. I know I was remarking on the days that I remember when the Liam was still in the Isabik in Munich 5 years ago. So incredible to see that you are your company's valued at over $1 billion as a unicorn for the aviation industry. So truly remarkable. Star, always thanks for your support and continuing to be a voice, a champion for innovation and entrepreneurship, for people to go and fly and break things and gather that data and make yourselves the most valuable entities in this ecosystem. And Graham, thank you again for sharing incredible insights in terms of where we are as an industry. There's so many other missing components in this conversation. There were, of the attendees, we did split up the sort of demographics. We had a significant portion of industry joining in from all across the value chain, the supply chain. We had a lot of entrepreneurs and founders, as well as investors, corporate strategic investors as well, thinking about how they want to look at where the opportunities are. And we had a lot of media attending as well. So we look forward to continuing to empower the entrepreneurs, continue to de-risk the investments that are happening in our industry. And with that, I'll just say we will also be sending out links to each of the panelists' respective domains in our next follow-up. So please stand by. We will make sure that each of the respective speakers has a specific program as part of their own campaign, whether it's the Grand Challenge, whether it's Agility Prime, whether it's the FAA's policy developing area. So with NextGen and all the incredible work we've seen Hyundai be doing. So it's, thank you again. If there's any closing remarks from our speakers, we will transition to sort of a phasing out, but I'll just say thank you all for joining, and we'll be in touch with you online. Cheers. I will also display the calendar of up and coming events. I think as a reminder, yes, this one was specifically on urban air mobility, but again, technology and innovation and opportunities for entrepreneurs adjacent to us is in so many other segmentations of our industry. We see 21 different market segments. Later today, we're doing an event with NASA on mass spectrometers, quantum sensors, artificial intelligence. And then we have a similar event coming up with Kness on their innovation opportunities. And in the US, we'll be doing our next startup selection committee and pitch event on July 9th. And then eventually we'll be doing our US UK roundtable before we do our entrepreneurs challenge with NASA. So thank you all for joining today. And yeah, we'll see you soon. Cheers.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.